This is Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. Today we're joined by Chris Waddell, a Carleton University professor who served as the CBC's Parliamentary Bureau Chief from 1993 to 2001.
Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me, Teresa.
Just before we hit record, we were talking about the state of journalism in the world right now, and it's not great. It's under attack in a number of different places, and newsrooms have been shrinking for a number of years. So I think it's a really good time to talk about journalism in Canada with a focus on the CBC, of course. So your background with the CBC is long and storied, and you've also had a long career in journalism beyond the CBC as well. Can you talk a little bit about your career as a journalist in this country?
I guess. I started out in journalism actually writing about car racing in the mid-1970s because my father was in the car business and my mother was a children's author. So maybe that's why I ended up doing that. But I was doing that, covering the Canadian Championship in the mid-1970s, which was a very good championship. People like Gilles Villeneuve, a couple of people who went on to win the Indianapolis 500, the World Driving Championship. But it got me across the country every summer. And at the same time, I was also doing started work on a PhD in the history department at York University, did my comprehensive exams in February 77, and then applied for and was accepted in the Ontario Legislative Internship Program. So I spent a year doing that, worked for a Liberal backbencher, Sean Conway, and a Conservative backbencher, Dr. Robert Elgee. Went back in 78 to do some car racing and finally start to think on my thesis. And Dr. Elgee had been appointed to the cabinet, and he called me up and asked me would I like to come and work for him. So I ended up working for him for 2 years as a legislative assistant, doing question period and other stuff in the Ministry of Labor. And it was in the days of the Conservative Davis minority government, 77 to 1981. I did that for 2 years, and then in 1980 was applied for and was hired by the Financial Post to be the downstream energy reporter, which was refining and marketing of oil, pipelines, National Energy Board, all that sort of stuff. I started a week before the National Energy Program in 1980, so I learned that pretty quickly. Had a great fun at the Post for 4 years, but then in 1984, went to the Globe and Mail because I decided I'd rather work for try working for a daily rather than a weekly, because the Post in those days was a weekly. McLean Hunter owned it. Went to the Globe, covered for the report on business, covered the auto industry for a year, and then got asked to go to Ottawa as an economics reporter and ended up there from 85 to 89. Covered all the Canada-U.S. free trade negotiations at the Ottawa end, and one of my colleagues, Jennifer Lewington, was in Washington doing the Washington end of it. In 88 was the bureau chief for the 88 election at the Globe. 89 came back to Toronto, was the associate editor, writing some editorials and dealing with the op-ed page, then spent a year as a national editor. Then in 1991, was lured away by the CBC to be their program producer for the National, and did that for 2 years. Then went back to Ottawa as Ottawa bureau chief for the CBC, Ottawa CBC Television, and then in 1995, I think it was, also became executive producer of special news specials for CBC. So did a lot of elections, a lot of other sorts of things, and then in 2001. Carleton University came after me and asked if I'd be interested in coming to teach there. I had a PhD, which helped at that point. I'd finished my thesis back in 1981. And so went to Carleton and spent 20 years at Carleton. Then became a professor emeritus in 2020, just after the my last year of teaching was the year the pandemic started. So my last couple of classes in March and April 2020 were on Zoom, as we were all banned from being in classes, and we were all dealing with the first part of COVID. So that's a really quick summary, I guess.
You covered a lot of territory there. One thing I do want to ask about before we move on to the CBC is,
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about Carleton's journalism program in general? Because it is, at least as far as I know, the best program in the country, one of the best in the world. Why is that program so important, and why does it have such a good reputation?
It has such a good reputation, I guess, 'cause it's been built up by a lot of people who have been journalists, who've come to teach and have been able to pass on the skills they learned as journalists to younger people. It's also been a program that's always been focused on giving people skills in not just one field, like what video or what used to be called television or radio, but trying to give people a broad education in all fields: audio, video, and print, of course, and that's the way the world has gone. So that's helped us as well. And the journalists in the last 20 years, with the arrival of the internet, journalists are asked to do everything. They're not asked to just be a television reporter or a radio reporter or write for a magazine. If you're working for a news organization, you're also expected to be able to handle the technical requirements of journalism, because over the last 20 years, what's also happened is most of the technical requirements of journalism have been taken away from people who are trained just to do that, like a camera operator or a video editor or an audio editor or someone running a studio. And journalists are now asked to be their own technical people as well. So they need to have the technical skills, because employers don't want to spend the time and money to train them. So the journalism programs, and Carleton has been very good at this, have always played a big role. Technical training has played a big role in journalism as well, and we were doing that for quite a while too.
Having worked in politics myself and knowing journalists, I think the general public doesn't realize how many hats journalists wear now. Like, if you're a reporter on, like we were talking about Colin DeMello, who's bureau chief at Global News for Queen's Park, and often you're filming your own spot, right? Like, you're sitting there with your cell phone, you're filming yourself, and then you're editing that, and then you're submitting it to the desk for the news at night, or you're writing the article about it. And I honestly don't know when journalists today sleep, because there's just too much work to do, and it does make it hard to cover things. So I want to turn now to a book that you co-wrote in 2020, and it's interesting timing, because I think it was well placed at the time, but of course we've had a whole pandemic since then, which has obviously altered how the news is made as well. So you wrote a book called The End of the CBC. What inspired you to write that book, and what can people expect when they crack it open to read it?
As I say, when people ask me about it, we do have a question mark at the end of that sentence, the end of the CBC. So
yes.
We were predicting its demise. In fact, I wrote it with David Terrace, who was at the Mount Royal University in Calgary, and ironically had been a legislative intern in the first year of the legislative internship program at Queen's Park. So, and I was in the second, so I'd known David for a very long time, and we collaborated on a variety of different things. But a series of events really came together in 2018, 2019, when we actually wrote the book, and that's the arrival of the streaming services and the money that they had to compete against traditional television, the decline in number of people who are watching traditional television and cable subscribers. And I should say the book is about, we say the end of the CBC with a question mark, but it's really about English language television. We don't talk about radio very much. We certainly don't talk about Radio Canada, which is a very separate and different world, serving a different audience with a different role in Quebec society as a defender of language, among other things that CBC doesn't really have in English Canada. So we'd seen those things happening. There was also a CRTC review, license review scheduled for 2020, and so we thought it was time to sort of to consider a major shakeup in what the public broadcaster was, and what it could be, and what it should do. So the book is actually our own proposal for fundamental change for the CBC on a bunch of areas, and we thought it was well timed, because it would come out not long before the license renewal hearing, and maybe some people would pay attention to it. But what we didn't anticipate was that it was also published the week that the country shut down for COVID. So U of T Press did it, and but it didn't get. I don't think it got sort of the attention that it might have had we not all been worrying about whether we were all going to get COVID.
And there is your proof that journalists report the news; they do not predict it, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
So you mentioned one thing there, which is the advent of things like Netflix. And when I think about Netflix, like, people forget now that when Netflix was first starting, it was hemorrhaging money, because it bought up all these expensive properties. It brought on big stars, and it's something that private corporations can do that something like the CBC can never do, which is hemorrhage cash to that level and just be in massive debt all the time. And it we're seeing it now with things like ChatGPT. It's the same kind of system where they spend money until they actually start making money. And it does create an uneven playing field for people who cannot do that, for organizations that can't do that. So the digital landscape changing obviously has really changed things for CBC in many different ways. But one of the ways is that these organizations like Netflix and other competitors and other more digital news sites, it's digital first, algorithm driven, and it does put pressure on journalists and news organizations to be kind of the same and to do similar things. And I think the CBC at its core, it's 90 years old this year. It has always been about creating a shared national experience. It came out, of course, the Great Depression and in the lead up to World War II. So this was a thing about, it was created for nation building purposes. It was created to tell the story of Canada and to connect Canadians. And we are now in an era where that is perhaps not the goal of the organization anymore. It has perhaps drifted into this realm of algorithm chasing. Do you think the CBC has abandoned its central mandate at this point to try and compete with these other organizations?
The other thing I think you should have said as well as that, and one of the reasons it was created as a radio broadcaster in the 1930s was the increasing penetration of Canada but from American broadcasters on the border and close by, and a concern that there needed to be a Canadian presence there, which there still needs to be. It's difficult to one other thing I should have said as well, and it gets to your question, is part of the problem really is that we're living with the Broadcasting Act, which was passed in 1991, which was before the internet arrived. The government has, for whatever reason, chosen not to update that during all this period. And questions about CBC's mandate, I think, get to a more serious issue, a broader issue, which is the media environment has changed dramatically in the period since 1991. It's changed dramatically since 2020. It keeps changing. And the thing you didn't mention, which is a huge component of this, is not just Netflix, but also social media, obviously. And what we need, what I think is needed and hasn't happened, is the federal government needs to indicate what it wants the public broadcaster to be and do, and it's been unable or unwilling to do that up to now. And that I mean, in the absence of the federal government saying this is our public broadcaster, this is the role we think it should play in the media environment, and one of the triggers to get us to write the book was this bizarre situation where, starting in about 2018 or 2019, the government of Canada started to fund media companies as they ran into more financial problems because they were losing advertising to Facebook and Google. So they came up with they started subsidizing the salaries of journalists and moved into other sorts of areas. So it seemed to us pretty bizarre that at the same time the government was subsidizing private sector media that had lost advertising, its own media company, the public broadcaster, was competing against those private companies, trying to take their advertising away for the CBC. And as a public policy approach, that made no sense at all. So one of the key driving points that we had in looking at the CBC and thinking about the CBC television was the need to get rid of advertising. And because if you get rid of advertising, it opens the door to do a bunch of different things. It also takes you out of a market competing with private broadcasters, and it allows you to create something different and distinctive. And the model for that, to some degree, was what's happened to CBC Radio for a long time, where if you travel across the country, if you happen to be driving across the country and you turn on your radio, it's pretty easy to tell what the CBC station is if you're twisting the dial and looking for all the different stations that come along. And it's also been, CBC's also been quite successful. It's a significant player in most of the major markets in the country, in part because it's distinctive and different than private radio. And it's also had an audience that English television has lost largely as it's competing against lots of other people. So what we felt was needed was, and still is needed in 2026, is a statement from the government about what it wants its broadcaster to be and do, what it thinks the role for the CBC should be in the current environment. And the CBC's view of that has always been, and it comes back a bit to your question a minute ago. New things keep coming along. The CBC keeps getting involved in new things to try and stay competitive, whether it was Snapchat or TikTok or other things that come and go. It never wants to stop doing anything, and yet it otherwise finds itself in a situation where as everything requires more money or wants more money, you can either continue to fund everything at the level that you're trying to keep everything alive, or you can make some tough decisions about what's important and where you think you have a competitive advantage and focus your money there. So that was part of our thinking in writing the book as well. And in the end, we came up, the proposal we came up with basically was to say CBC should get out of everything except news and current affairs. CBC television should get out of everything except news and current affairs, as that was both very important to the country to tell Canadians about what was happening across the country. It was also at a time when, as you noted, that's gone on ever since, the private media has been disappearing. In local radio stations, local community newspapers, newspapers have cut back on the amount of what they're doing. All those things have happened as well. So the importance of Canadians understanding both what's going on in their own country and also understanding what's going on in the rest of the world and how that affects their own country, I think has grown even more important than when we wrote the book in 2020.
So it's interesting because you touched on about 42 different things there that I want to dig
into,
but I'm going to pull them apart slowly.
Sure.
But one of the main things is essentially what you're arguing. It's funny that you're talking about this need to narrow focus, because this is something that happens in government too, right? There's all these different ministries and they all want to be the star of whatever it is. I was just chatting with some friends today about a problem I have noticed in the Carney government is you'll have a news release that has 9 quotes in it, which is an absurd number of quotes, of course, because everybody wants their little piece of the pie and to make sure that they're seen and all that kind of stuff. And it's similar when you have a national broadcaster. There are so many priorities. There's so many different streams of content and where you need to be. Social media bans on Meta have helped that out a little bit, but you mentioned TikTok, you mentioned Snapchat. There's all these different ways that an organization like that wants to stay competitive, but at the same time you do kind of have to narrow focus to do what you do very well. So a lot of people will point to the example of the BBC, which is not entirely dissimilar from the CBC, but is different in a number of important ways. One of those is the fact that the UK is just a much smaller area geographically. It's largely, you can argue if it's unilingual or not, but right. There's a different background there that the BBC was formed in as compared to the CBC. UK is a very decentralized country. So it begs the question of, can we actually do a BBC model, or is the national broadcaster model itself outdated for a country of our size and cultural diversity, in 2026 in this internet age?
I don't think it's outdated at all. I think that a big difference between the CBC and the BBC that you didn't identify was how it's funded. The BBC, and that's coming under increasing pressure in the UK as well, because the BBC is funded through television licenses that everybody pays. And so you have a television, you have to pay a certain amount every year. The problem with that, of course, in the UK at the moment is fewer and fewer people are having televisions, and they're getting their information on phones or on, and the question becomes, should you try to do a screen tax? Should you do this, that, or something else? So the BBC's funding, has always been much more predictable than the CBC's, because CBC's is funded by parliamentary appropriation, and governments can increase it and governments can decrease it, supplemented, of course, by advertising revenue. And the BBC also, I think, has always had kind of a global presence rather than just a national presence. Canada, CBC tried a little bit of a broader presence for a while in the 1990s when CBC News World, its news channel, was broadcast by some people in the United States, but that kind of ended at a period, and it's more just Canadian. But I think with both the technology and the ability to reach people in so many different ways these days, I don't think having a national broadcaster is outdated at all. I think the question becomes more, what content do you have on that? and how are you willing and able to reflect the various different regions and the different ideas and different things going on across the country. And that becomes a question of your resources. It becomes a question of your commitment and interest, and a question, because I mean, one of the great things that's happened in the last 20 years is technology has allowed us now to report from anywhere, anytime. I mean, back 20 years ago, when I was bureau chief for the Globe in the 1988 election, and our CBC friends were traveling on the leaders tours with us, they were carrying like 300 pounds of video editing equipment everywhere, and then they had to find somewhere to feed from, find a post, a telephone post they could plug into, and they could feed it up to a satellite and those sorts of things. Now, basically, you can establish yourself as a journalist with a smartphone, and if you don't like editing on smartphones and video, at least, it's not that much fun anyway. It's better on a computer screen and a laptop computer. That's all you need, and you can make connections to your head office and anywhere around the world. So journalists can now report from anywhere in a way they couldn't report from anywhere 15 or 20 years ago. So that, I think, makes it possible to be much easier and more possible to be a national broadcaster, and to tell people across the country about what's going on. I happened to be listening to something on CBC Radio the other day that Matt Galloway did about the 60th or 70th anniversary of what's called the broadcast, which was basically a fishing broadcast in Newfoundland, and it was a fabulous story, and how important it was in telling people about the weather, about what was going on in communities, and all those sorts of things. And those are the types of stories that are great national stories, not just local stories. And that's where a public broadcaster can really play a role in doing that, and telling Canadians about what the life of other Canadians is like around the world, around the country. And the second part of it is the other thing that we've seen happen is a dramatic decline in Canadian correspondents being overseas, reporting back from other news organizations. So the Globe and Mail and CBC are really about the only people who have significant global presence at the moment, at a time when we really need, more than ever, I would argue, journalists on the ground in other countries. Some of those are countries that a lot of Canadians may have come from originally, whether it's India or whether it's the Ukraine and other places. And we need them to be telling stories through Canadian eyes in ways that reflect the issues and the sensibilities that we have in Canada, rather than having to rely on the New York Times or Agence France Presse or Associated Press or other publications who, no matter how much they think they might be global, still end up reflecting the attitudes and values of the home-based country for them.
It's funny that you mentioned the New York Times, because I have read articles in the Times about issues that I know about, from my professional career and things like that. And I'm like, this is just not factual. And I think, it really does speak to needing to have that Canadian context on some of these stories, of course. You mentioned something there, which was how we tell Canadian stories to other Canadians, and also just locally as well. So we are in an era now where local news is just being eviscerated. There is some efforts to revive it. Largely, most of local news at this point, if it's private, is owned by major corporations that just sort of, similar to like Reuters, they just kind of funnel out content from the central hub, and it's not necessarily local. But it is really important to tell those stories. I think of things like out in the East Coast, when they've had major storms like hurricanes and things like that. Like, it is important to have the CBC exist, even just from like an emergency broadcast perspective. If that's something that private companies are not going to be doing. So there is a health and safety component to it. There is a informational component to it, of being able to get the information you need in real time about your local situation. But there's also, even like, we just had the Olympics, of course. So having local content about your local athletes, it does help unite the country. It does help tell the story of your communities. And I think it's really, really important. So CBC recently has started a regional hiring push, which is great to see. And it's meant to help bolster local coverage. And it was similar to what you were just talking about. You don't need a big studio setup now to have a regional presence, because you can actually just have one reporter there and they can move around the region and tell those stories from their cell phone. What does CBC need to do to make sure that push is successful and also beneficial to the communities that are being covered?
Well, the biggest thing they can do is to get the stories on the air that people are doing from those communities. And you're right, there's over the last couple of years, there's been about 40 journalists hired, and they've been put in smaller communities across the country. Dawson City, Yukon, Swift Current, Saskatchewan, Moose Jaw, Flin Flon, Peel region in Ontario, outside Toronto, Shadow Game area, and they're all areas that don't get on national newscasts very often, and often don't even get on regional newscasts or regional programming. So putting people there, they've got the tools to do the work and do the reporting. And the next question becomes, what can be done to, and what is being done to actually ensure that the stories they do are getting on the air, and that the people who are deciding what stories get on the air in a regional newscast or a regional program aren't saying, well, we're not really interested in that. We're interested in something else. But I think they have moved significantly in that direction. Part of it is a result of the money that Google has paid, the $100 million that Google is paying to the local to media companies across the country to offset the fact that they've taken. Google's taken a lot of the advertising that used to belong to those other companies, and Google's not doing it out of a spirit of goodwill. There was a negotiation with the federal government what actually happened. So that's good, but the problem, of course, with that is that may end at some point, and Google may decide to end it at a fairly short notice, and that can be a real problem for everybody. So, but at the moment, what's happened is CBC has hired a lot more people, and sometimes they've taken people from existing local media, which has not necessarily made the local news organizations happy to see some of their good people go to the CBC, but that's the nature of what happens. But the other thing I think that is worth thinking about in all this, and in local and doing, CBC put their own people on the ground, yes, but one of the things we talked about in the book a bit is there are opportunities for CBC to change its attitude if they get out of competition with private broadcasters. They're not so much worried as much about audience necessarily. So why not make the stories that your reporters do available to any local news organizations that want to use them? Why not use the platform that CBC Online has to run good stories from those local news organizations on the CBC platform, to say to people, hey, here's a good story about a town. If you want to see more of that, you should support that local news outlet and give it money or buy a subscription or whatever it might be. So in effect, one of the opportunities for the CBC, I think, is to switch from being a competitor against the private broadcasters to being an organization that will help build and maintain private sector media in the country, because private sector media is important to have, and it's important to contain. It's not having just the CBC is not sufficient. We need the more reporters you have on the ground, the more stories you're actually going to see and hear and learn more about your community. So that's important to do. And we think the CBC has a role to play in that, both locally, but also a role to play that internationally. With the reporters that it actually has, why not make CBC content available to any other news organization across the country? So if you've got a reporter in India, for instance, as the CBC actually has, make those stories available. So if somebody has a local website and they want to run that story on their local website, let them run it on their local website. If you take CBC out of competing for advertising dollars and competing for eyes of audience, then it doesn't matter as much. The more broadly spread out and the more broadly people can see and hear the stories, the better off for the CBC anyway. So there's opportunities to do some of these different things, but again, it comes back to, in part, on the big picture, what's the role the public broadcaster should be playing in the media environment today? Is it competing for advertising dollars with the crippled private sector, or is it trying to do something different that will both set it apart from everyone else and at the same time also attract audience, also give some of these people who are struggling to survive some potential content that might help them too?
We're going to get to advertising in a minute, but I do want to talk about it sort of dovetails from the lack of regional coverage, which is there's a complaint out there, I would say, that the CBC is increasingly talking to, an urban progressive audience versus, being able to speak and for rural conservative Canadians. And part of that, I suspect would stem from having a lack of regional local news. Part of that is, like I have opinions about this, and obviously this has been in the news a lot lately. All the journalists I know, I've never known any of them to really have any huge political slant. I think they're pretty fair and balanced, and they try and do that as a professional thing. But I do think with the CBC, there are a lot of political shows on the CBC that, talking heads come on, give the perspective of each of the parties, and it's always a balance across the board of who gets to be there from each of the different parties, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it does create this view of the CBC as like a political entity. And there are, a lot of folks who perhaps think that conservative voices are not welcome there. How much truth is there to that?
I wouldn't make it a political argument. I think there are political parties, largely the conservative parties, who do a lot of fundraising on the basis of that. In the Harper government, they regularly used to send out fundraising emails. Look how evil the CBC is being to us now. Send us money to help us fight them. I think I would place it more as geographic rather than political, and I think it comes back to the issue of do people see themselves? Do people see people like themselves on television news stories, in television news and current affairs programming? Are the issues that they're facing issues that ever get the attention? I mean, to give you a good example, a different sort of example, agriculture and food is a huge industry in this country. How often do we see stories about agriculture and food on national news programming or news broadcasts?
Yeah.
On maybe, but not very often. Yet there's a huge number of people on the one level, there's a huge number of people involved in that and producing it, and on the other level, it's also of great interest to lots of people too. So I think it's more reflects the urban and rural divide rather than it does reflect but I don't cast it as much a political issue as more of an issue of people want and like to see stories about stuff that affects them, and too often it's been urban stories and not enough it's been going out to other areas and see. But again, if a different CBC was around and it was sharing material, and first of all, it has more of its own reporters on the ground in smaller communities. Hopefully that will get more stories on the air. It also creates opportunities to do partnerships with some of these, the news organizations that are around at the moment. Yes, a lot of traditional ones have collapsed and gone out of business. We've lost a lot of community, but we've also gained some ones as well that are quite significant. Now, what's tended to happen, and again, this comes back to one of the things that was, I guess, was one of the driving forces for the book for us, was that the news organizations that are in most trouble and have been in the most trouble for the past decade are the news organizations that try to do everything for everyone. And that's your daily newspaper that covers everything from, news, sports, weather, traffic, courts, food criticism, movies, entertainment, and those sorts of things. You have to be the news organizations that are successful these days, and there are some that are around, are organizations that are, first of all, online. Not very many are actually printing anything because of the costs of printing and distribution. But the second thing related to that is they tend to be about one or two issues. So you've got some that are, the Narwhal, for instance, which just does a lot of environmental reporting. You've got the National Observer,
Right.
which some environmental reporting and also some political reporting. The Tyee in BC, which has looked at the BC area. The Sprawl in Calgary, that's looked at local, and Taproot in Edmonton, that looked at local issues. The Local in Toronto, which has done some great work on local issues, Toronto issues. And the CBC has and is starting to do some partnerships with some of those, as have other news organizations. The Toronto Star has partnered with the Narwhal on a few things on some of the Greenbelt investigations in Ontario and those things. So it's another argument for why the CBC needs to think about what it's doing and stop doing things where it can't compete very well, and instead focus on the things that it can compete well, where it has where it has the potential for a leadership role. And to us, that came back to news and current affairs, and it wasn't sports, it wasn't entertainment and drama, and it's not all those other sorts of things. So, and it's not to say they don't do a good job in it, but the audiences are small, and if you're looking at entertainment and drama, yes, it's important for Canadian stories to be told, but maybe we should be thinking about marketing those stories. Maybe the National Film Board is an idea, but marketing those stories to the global, to the global streaming services. We've seen a couple of examples recently where that's actually happened very successful, and there are opportunities for more of that. But that's so one of our thoughts, going back to your first question, was if you're redesigning a new CBC, you can't continue to be everything to everybody. You've got to decide on what you want it to be. And the combination of the significant role they already play in news and current affairs across the country, their international presence, and beyond that, the role they can play on misinformation and disinformation, which is a growing important issue, suggests that should be their focus. And we still, the book argued that, and I think there's still 6 years later, there's still a good argument to be made for that.
I want to talk about ad revenue now, because sort of what you were just saying, I think it's important for public organizations to know their purpose. So, when I look at political financing, because I've done a lot of fundraising in politics, I see private donations as actually detrimental to people's belief in the political system, because they say, oh, well, it's just donors getting their way and big money talks, yada, yada, yada. There is a tendency now in journalism to chase, well, there has been for a long time, but to chase advertising dollars. So it used to be that you would get someone to place a big ad in your newspaper, and that was what you were doing. Google and Meta have obviously changed the game on that. They've eaten up pretty much all of the advertising dollars for anything that would be related to news, which means there's a shrinking pie for everybody else. And what this has led to is you have whole departments now in newspapers, for example, that do advertorials, which is basically paid ads that write like an article, but have been paid by some company or organization to be put in a newspaper and appear like a normal article. So we have that. We have other ways, I'm assuming a lot of ad revenue now is through digital websites and things like that, because you can change that quickly and all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to a public organization like the CBC, my concern is that, one, it risks ruining the user experience, because, like you're on your CBC Gem and then you're hearing during the Olympics, there was that like bear commercial for, I think it was like one of the gas companies, and they could not stand it. But, you have these ads and you're like, this is the CBC. I pay my tax dollars. Shouldn't I be getting this ad free, right? Like there is that assumption that you should be having that, and it sort of ruins the experience of the public broadcaster. But then the other part of it is you start to wonder if it's, muddying impressions of the editorial independence of such an organization, because it's now partially being driven by ads and the people behind those ads. So do you think in this environment we're in now that the CBC's current mix of some public funding and also ad revenue, is it still viable, number one? And two, does it create these risks in terms of both, driving users away because it's not a great experience, and also making them maybe trust the source a little less?
There's always been tension between editorial departments and advertising or publishers at newspapers, and advertisers want to be happy to have a special advertising segment that looks as much like the newspaper as it, so the audience is kind of tricked into thinking that it's editorial content rather than advertising content. That's also true. But yeah, there's those pressures on television as well, and on the CBC as well. I think some of it comes down to product placement and other sorts of things, but I think advertising in the current environment, one of the big reasons why the streaming services have been so successful is because no advertising.
Yep.
right?
And the backlash that's happening right now is because they're starting to introduce it because, as we mentioned before, they've hemorrhaged money and they need to make it back. And it was the same thing with Meta. Like, you've probably watched the film about the founding of Facebook, and the whole point was we don't have ads, right? And so this is the user experience going downhill, but now they have such a monopoly that there's no option, right? So, anyways.
So not having advertising, in fact, can become a marketing advantage, providing you are able to make an argument for what you're doing and persuade your funders, in this case, the government of Canada, to fund you at a level that allows you to do what you want to do or what you think needs to be done. So there's always a risk. Advertising also distorts programming. I mean, if you're running the national on CBC television, you've got to stop every 3 minutes to run, every 5 or 7 minutes or 10 minutes to run 3 or 4 minutes of ads. It really upsets the program in an attempt to build, and that's more particularly true for a program that, like the Fifth Estate or something like that, or some of those sorts of programs. So advertising distorts, not even leaving aside with the issue of does it actually distort choices, it just distorts the ability to produce a program that is coherent and flows from one story to the next story and doesn't have anything that breaks up and of course doesn't also have anything that gives the audience an opportunity to go away and do something else, particularly in an era when we have people who are on their screens while they're also watching TV and doing those sorts of things too. So I don't think there's always tension between advertisers and news organizations about wanting to sort of do special reports or wanting to do advertorials that look like newspaper or look like TV, but actually aren't. Of course, we're also exposed to a lot more of that now through influencers on social media, and we have no idea who they're being paid by and what they're being paid by and what they're doing to say whatever they want to say about whether it's about pharmaceuticals, about kitchen appliances or cars or whatever it actually might be. So we're flooded with all of that. So it would be nice to have a space where you didn't have to worry about some of that, I think, which I think the public broadcaster does provide on radio and should be providing on television as well.
It made me think of HBO. So if you watch an HBO show, you know that, you tune in at the top of the hour, but there's like 5-10 minutes of not necessarily ads, but like promos for other programming they have and all that kind of stuff. And then eventually the show kicks in and then it's uninterrupted for the next hour, which is a very lovely experience. So it could even be something like that going forward. I do want to talk about the funding model for CBC in general from the government side. So we are currently in a moment of austerity and departments and arm's length organizations funded by the government are being asked to shrink their budgets by 15%. Now it's not a flat 15%. Some organizations will be more, some will be less, etc. But everyone's being asked to belt tighten at this time. But this is also happening on the backdrop of newsrooms are already shrinking around the world. So given that context of being asked to do more with less, as that's already been happening for a long time in news, can the CBC realistically make these cuts and still deliver robust news and quality programming for Canadians?
I don't know enough about what cuts have actually been asked from the CBC. We've been through a little bit of a yo-yo period in the last little while where the Trudeau government gave the CBC more money. Then it appears now some of it may be coming back. It's going back and forth, which I think comes down to what anybody needs, and we've seen more broadly for the business community in the country as well, is what you might call stable funding or stable financing. So you know what's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years. One of the problems we face economically at the moment generally is with our relationship with the United States, we don't know what's going to happen next week, let alone next year, and so nobody can make any long-term plans. And that's also true in broadcasting. But it also requires, I think, one of the, when you're dealing with cuts and those sorts of issues, there's 2 ways to do with it. Two obvious ways. One of which is to, if you've got to cut 15%, then you cut 15% out of everybody's budget, or you make a decision that we should stop doing some things. And again, that comes back to our book and what we were talking about, and you have to stop doing some things. And or if the government wants the public broadcaster to do something specifically, like let's say cover the Olympics, it needs to fund the Olympic coverage realistically and not have that come out of normal budgets. I mean, that's a simple answer to a much more complicated question, but decisions need to be made about what advances what your objective is, and what is tangential to what your objective is, particularly when you're facing competition from streaming services and you're facing competition from private cable television channels and sports, and even facing it in children's programming in some of those areas. Can you continue to do all that stuff, or should you be better? Across the board cuts generally sort of sustain things that you probably shouldn't be doing and cripple things that you do well. And so you need to, I would argue that it's a time to actually make tough decisions about what the public broadcaster should be doing. And that again comes back to what we talked about before. What role does the government see the public broadcaster playing in the current media environment and in the media environment moving forward? So far, I think the new president, Marie-Philippe Bouchard, has done a good job. Some of the things that are in the new 5-year plan they recently announced play to some of the things we've been talking about, and making the broadcaster more representative across the country, working potentially with other media companies, but still they've got that advertising level and the problems that go with that. And as I say, I think you can open your eyes to doing a lot more things differently if you're not competing with what's left of the private media world for advertising dollars. Now, how you make the, I don't know enough about the internal bits of the CBC budget, and of course people talk about the 1.5 or 1.6 billion dollars that is that's a parliamentary appropriation, or maybe 1.4. But that's going for English and French radio and television. It's also going for 6, I think it's 8 Indigenous languages they broadcast in at the moment. So it's a big picture of a lot of different things. But I think you need to. The time has come to actually make decisions about, and also even as it comes down to things like, you want to jump on board with the latest trend. Well, it's TikTok now, and a year and a half from now it'll be something else, and you have to make tough decisions about. You don't know. It's difficult, and I don't deny that for a second, because you don't know what the long-term impact of some of these things is going to be. So you hesitate and wanting to say, well, we're not going to do that. But you also wonder if you spread yourself too thinly, so that you're actually not producing the quality or range of material that you'd like to be able to produce if you were actually focusing on fewer things.
It's interesting that you're talking about, what's trending now, because what's trending now is this meme of looking back to the 90s with this sense of nostalgia of, what you used to look like in the 90s and what you used to be about. You were a parliamentary bureau chief in the 90s, and
yes.
I think it's an interesting period to look back at for the CBC, because of course we also had an austerity period back then as well, of course, in the 1990s under the Chrétien government. So it makes me think about what kind of programming choices you would have had to make. Now, of course, you're not competing with as many TV channels back then. You're not competing with the internet, but you are still trying to figure out how to program and inform Canadians during a time when your budget is being stripped down. So what lessons do you think we can learn from the 90s, from the CBC, to take into the CBC's relationship with Canadians today?
One of the big things we did have to do in the 1990s is we had to cut back on how we covered politics and public policy, and we lost people, and that meant we could no longer maintain some of the beats that we maintained. And we also had the pressures from an all news channel, which wanted stuff all the time too. So what it meant was that we could no longer protect a journalist to say, okay, you're going to be responsible, say, for foreign aid, foreign affairs, defense, a cluster of those sorts of things. Someone else is responsible for issues related to justice, which might be the courts, which might be criminal code, which might be those sorts of things, and someone else responsible for social issues, which could be healthcare, employment, unemployment insurance, those areas. We had to break some of that down because we didn't have enough people to cover things that we had to cover. So 20 or 30 years later, the issues that journalists are faced with and have to cover these days are much more complex and complicated than they used to be even in the 1990s. And I'm talking everything from the healthcare system to climate change to the energy industry to the defense spending, defense procurement, employment, unemployment. So if you don't have the funding to be able to allow your journalists to specialize, then you end up not being able to find the good stories, the stories that are most important to Canadians, and you end up being more vulnerable to the legions of public affairs and communications people that have grown. You can draw the two lines on a graph, the number of journalists going down and the number of communications and PR people going up. And so the material you get tends to be more from you just don't understand what these stories are if you're a journalist, if you don't have a degree of specialization. And that's one of the problems that's on the one side, one of the problems that mainstream news organizations have faced as they've cut back in reporting and cut back in journalists, is to lose a specialization. And that's created the opportunities for some of these online publications to come on and sort of say, well, we're going to spend all our time talking about the environment. We're not, or about climate change. So if you're interested in those sorts of issues, don't come to us. Don't come to the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail or the CBC, because they just don't have the time or effort to do that. Now, that's not on climate change. That's not totally fair, but there are issues like that. So what you lose when you do the cuts, is you lose the degree of specialization that you need to have among journalists in order to deal with and explain complicated issues to audiences.
When I talk to a journalist, like I'm amazed at how much they know, but it is very, very hard to be more than, an inch deep and a mile wide on any issues.
That's right.
When you have to cover so many different things. I do want to talk about this sort of defund the CBC movement, because this is something that perhaps started as a bit of a fringe conversation and has now really found a home in the official opposition. You were talking about the Harper era emails. Those emails are still going on today.
Oh yeah, I know for sure.
This is something that regularly happens.
Although today it's make Don Cherry a Order of Canada recipient. So
yes, it's true. It's true. That's in the emails as well.
It's all attempts to harvest emails that they can use then for fundraising purposes subsequently. So yeah,
100%. Most of it is that. I think there are probably people in the conservative movement who believe that the CBC is past its best before date, but if they were to get their way, if the CBC were to disappear tomorrow, what would Canadians lose that private media simply couldn't replace?
A lot of coverage of a lot of the country, but I mean, I was always, slogans are great, but turning slogans into public policy is actually a little more difficult than just standing up and spouting the slogan time after time. I was always, and still remain, very skeptical about the idea that they would end up funding defunding the CBC. First of all, the statement was made that wouldn't affect Radio Canada. They'd keep Radio Canada as something separate.
Right, yeah.
Okay, well, that's great, except Radio Canada and CBC share premises across large parts of the country. In Winnipeg, they're or in Calgary or in somewhere else, they're in the same building. So you're going to take half of the rent paid or half of the building out and leave the other half there. The second part of it is, if you defund the CBC, which is I think largely directed at English television, and you've got a French broadcaster in French, where are they going to get their video of anything else going on across the rest of the country? And as people are talking about the potential for us to be moving into another era of discussions about separation referenda in Quebec, and you've got a broadcaster who is broadcasting in Quebec but isn't broadcasting anything else from the rest of Canada, well, that really can't help Canada's position if there were to be a future a future referendum. So I think there's that. And I also never really believed that that the conservative backbenchers were as critical of CBC Radio as they may have been, or may have been told to be by people in the leader's office about CBC television. Partly because CBC Radio has a much bigger impact in a lot of smaller communities across the country, and as they're losing their own private sector media, community newspapers, local radio stations, the CBC has a role to play and can play a bigger role. And I was told, now I don't know that this is true, but I think it was, when the Trudeau government came up with the subsidies for wages for journalists back in 2018, 2019, it was my understanding that the Conservative Party wanted to oppose that, and Mr. Andrew Scheer, I believe, was leading the party at that point, wanted to be opposed to that, and his own backbenchers said, "Don't do that because radio's having a big impact in our own communities," and they ended up not opposing it. And I think defunding the CBC is a great slogan if you want to get emails to send fundraising letters to, but I think you would find it much more difficult to do in reality, and never really thought it would actually happen. But maybe I think now where we are at and what's happened in the last year or so, the likelihood of that happening is significantly less than it would have been even if there's a conservative government in the future. Just because of the Canadian nationalism, Canadian patriotism, fears of not sure who our friends are these days, and things like that.
Well, exactly. Like I think this moment we've had over the last year has really shown the importance of our national narrative to our collective sovereignty. Like we are no longer allowed to be complacent about the stories that we tell about ourselves and to the world. And I think, the national broadcaster, or as you mentioned earlier too, the NFB, which I have been concerned about too, because they're facing massive cuts, and we're facing cuts even before Carney as well. These historic organizations that have existed for a long time, but were created specifically for the need that we have today in society. We need to be doing more to protect them. So that actually brings me to my last question, which is, we're at 90 years of the CBC this November. For the CBC to actually reach its centennial in 2036, if you were appointed to review the mandate of the organization, what would you propose to ensure it actually continues to exist for another 10 years and beyond?
Well, that's an easy question, an easier question to answer, perhaps, if I had an idea what the media environment was going to be like in the next 10 years. But you really have no ideas. And one of the challenges for us in writing the book, when we wrote it back in 2018 and 2019, was things kept changing. And so our publisher, U of T Press, we gave them the book in October. It came out in March, and all that period of time we're chewing our nails and sort of saying, well, this has changed. What can we do? And we're still in some of that. I think for the CBC to survive longer term, I think some of the things they're doing at the moment are the right things. I think the new president has started it off on a better track than it's been on in the last little while. But I think it still needs, number one, a statement from government about what role it should play, funding from government based on that statement that would ensure that it could do that role, and a guarantee that that funding is not going to be changed every year or two, but gives them the sort of 4 or 5 year horizon, at least, that industry and other people require to make long-term planning and make long-term decisions. And then getting out of advertising and changing the relationship between the CBC and the private media in the country, so that the CBC can use its base and its strengths to actually support existing media organizations and help rebuild them from what's been a terrible cutback over the last 10 or 15 years. And I think the CBC has the potential and the funds and the infrastructure to be able to do that, while still continuing to be a significant player in Canadians' lives, and also play a big role on addressing disinformation and misinformation issues, being a reliable source of information people can turn to, and all of which is still why I think our argument about reducing the CBC's role to primarily news and current affairs is actually even more relevant in some respects now than it was before. But it would be a very different CBC with a mandate to actually support and help build media in Canada from a period of terrible cutbacks and the loss of people, the loss many people face to their own local community and local news and information.
Well, there you go. I think we've topped out right at an hour, so good work by us.
Yeah, right.
I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I think this is a topic that obviously a lot of people are interested in and concerned about, so I appreciate having an expert on the topic drop in.
Well, I mean, there's lots of other experts around, and as was once, I don't know who said it, most people have their own job, and their second job is president of the CBC. So critics across the country. That's been going on for a long time, and it will probably continue for quite a while.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian-owned company specializing in strategic communications, narrative development, and content creation. Our music today was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.